Welcome to this explainer. You know, we've all heard those incredibly glamorous startup success stories, right? But today's source material takes us into an absolute nightmare scenario for any entrepreneur. Picture it, the glow of laptop screens at 2 a.m., that heavy, exhausted silence, the terrifying realization that the end is literally knocking on your front door. We're exploring a remarkable narrative today that just strips away all that usual corporate glamour. It boils business survival down to a single, high-stakes, make-or-break moment. We're going to look at the raw power of conviction and how just one single interaction can completely rewrite a company's entire destiny. So, let's start in a very dark place. Section 1, the brink of failure. Not interested, right? Two incredibly simple words. But man, when you're trying to keep a company alive, they are basically the universal investor translation for, please go away. According to the source material, this was the exact echoing response the founder received from literally every single investor they pitched to. I mean, imagine the sheer psychological weight of that repetition. You're doing pitch after pitch, meeting after meeting, pouring your absolute heart and soul into explaining your vision, only to be met with a massive wall of polite or, maybe not so polite, apathy. Every single door they knocked on just remained firmly shut. And this continuous rejection, it wasn't just stalling their progress, it was actively draining the life right out of the team. And the reality was just undeniable. The bank account was almost entirely empty. We're not talking about a temporary cash flow hiccup here or some strategic restructuring of assets. No, we're talking about rock bottom. In the startup world, cash is oxygen, and we are looking at a company that is quite literally gasping for breath. The money was simply gone. When your bank account reflects nothing but zeros, every single decision gets magnified 1,000 times over. You aren't thinking about quarterly growth anymore, are you? You're just thinking about how on earth you're going to keep the lights on tomorrow. Time had officially become their absolute worst enemy. The team had only a few weeks of runway left. Just think about the sheer tension of that ticking clock for a second. A few weeks? That means maybe one, maybe two more payroll cycles tops? It means looking your deeply dedicated team right in the eye, knowing that in less than a month, you might actually have to tell them it's all over and they need to pack up their desks. Complete collapse wasn't just some vague threat in the future. It was a scheduled event on the calendar. This is the ultimate pressure cooker. But here is exactly where the narrative shifts. Facing that massive wall of continuous rejection and an empty bank account, the founder made a choice. Section 2, the honest conversation. Usually, founders lean on what we all expect, right? The flashy presentation with those super optimistic hockey stick charts that somehow miraculously always go up and to the right. But this founder knew that strategy had already totally failed them. So they decided to make one more call. But this time, they completely abandoned the playbook. They threw the pitch deck right out the window. They opted instead for just a raw, honest conversation about reality, the massive challenges they were facing, and their core vision. It was essentially the ultimate anti-pitch. Let's actually break down the mechanics of this critical phone call. Instead of projecting this false sense of security, the founders shared the stark reality over polished numbers. They laid all their cards flat on the table. They openly acknowledged severe challenges, completely refusing to hide the fact that the bank account was practically empty and their runway was basically dissolving. They leaned right into the incredible vulnerability of that moment. But, and this is absolutely crucial, they maintained a clear, unwavering vision. They essentially said, look, things are terrible right now. The math looks really bad, but here is exactly where we are going and why it still matters. This radical honesty completely stripped away the usual corporate theater and forced a deeply, deeply human connection. That single, radically honest conversation was the spark. Which brings us to Section 3, the startup turnaround. It is genuinely fascinating to look at this timeline. Look at this. They went from being mere weeks away from total failure, staring right down the barrel of bankruptcy, to making that one decisive call where radical honesty completely replaced the traditional sales pitch. And then bam! Just months later, the startup is totally back on its feet. It really shows us that a business's trajectory isn't always this slow, gradual curve. Sometimes a single, incredibly dense moment of authentic communication can completely snap a downward turn and launch it right in the opposite direction. What truly amazed me in the source material is that the results of that call weren't just financial, they were cultural and physical. The startup didn't just survive, it completely revived. The team expanded, that crushing, heavy silence of impending doom, gone, replaced by the hustle and bustle of actual progress. The energy completely returned to the office. The workspace transformed right back into an environment of innovation, rather than just acting as a waiting room for failure. And I think this proves that when leadership acts with absolute, transparent conviction, it doesn't just secure capital. It actively re-injects lifeblood right back into the entire organization. So why exactly did this anti-pitch work when the polished presentation failed so miserably? Well, that brings us to Section 4, investing in conviction. A specific quote from the source material really jumped out at me here. Sometimes people don't invest in the idea, they invest in the founder's conviction. And honestly, when you think about it, in moments of extreme crisis, investors and partners totally know that the initial idea might need to pivot. Those polished numbers you're showing, they're largely fiction anyway. What they are truly looking for is the resilience of the person steering the ship. So when that founder stripped away the flashy slides and spoke from a place of raw, unvarnished reality, they weren't selling a product anymore. They were demonstrating unshakable belief. That conviction, that is exactly what the investor ultimately bought into. It really is an incredible domino effect. One single honest call, made against all possible odds and amidst an absolute sea of rejections, led to one decision. One decision by an investor who saw right past the empty bank account and recognized the raw determination of the founder. And ultimately, everything changes. The business is saved, the team grows, and the vision actually survives. It reminds us that monumental shifts in business don't always require these massive, complex strategies. Sometimes they quite literally hinge on a single moment of absolute clarity and courage. Which brings us to a critical question for you to consider as we wrap up this explainer today. Are you relying on a flashy presentation or your deep conviction? Think about it. When you are backed into a corner, when your runway is terrifyingly short and those rejections are just piling up, what is your default move? Do you try to polish up the numbers and hide behind a beautifully designed slide deck? Or do you have the courage to strip it all back, present the stark reality, and let your unwavering belief do the talking? The story we've unpacked today proves that when absolutely everything else fails, genuine conviction might just be the only currency that actually matters. Definitely something to think about the next time you have to make a call that decides it all.